Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program. My name is Catherine Chiriboga, and I'm a Programs and Partnerships Librarian. Each year, Arlington Public Library hosts more than 3,500 programs. And if this is the first one you've ever attended, welcome. If you have attended previously, welcome back. Thank you to the Friends of the Arlington Public Library for their continued support for all of our programs. All proceeds support programs like these, so we're very grateful for them. And thank you, as always, to One More Page Books for tonight's book signing. I see some of you have copies of the book, but if you need one by the end, they're in the lobby. A little housekeeping, please silence your devices. Earlier this year, we celebrated the centenary of writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin with authors Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., Anna Malika Tubbs, Jesmyn Ward, and George M. Johnson. Later this month, we finish our exploration of Afrofuturism in the Arlington Read series. So some of you have already joined us for our evenings with authors Roseanne A. Brown, Nnedi Okorafor. The series ends with an interview with Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, author of the thrilling Chain Gang All-Stars, in 2 weeks. So we hope to see you then. Tonight, we start our month of Native American programming to celebrate the culture. And tonight we have Dr. Anton Treuer, who is a graduate of Princeton University and holds an MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University, and as you can see, he is an author of many books, as you can see up on the header part of the screen. His work on equity, education, and culture has made him an expert on racial equity, cultural humility, tribal sovereignty, and history, Ojibwe language and culture, and strategies for student success. As he gives his presentation, I would like to remind the audience and our viewers online that Arlington, Virginia is the ancestral home and hunting ground of the Doeg and Tuxaconnet, Packmonkey, I really hope I didn't butcher that, and Pascatawe people, many within the Algonquin language group and some within the Powhatan Paramount chiefdom. So just a little reminder. We recognize the indigenous people who have come to live in Arlington, whether as new residents or as descendants of those who were forced to leave. We celebrate the sacred ground and place and pledge to improve our stewardship of this irreplaceable bounty. And it's great too in the library, I have to add that as well. Please give a big Arlington welcome to Dr. Anton Treuer.
Miigwech, Kwe Maji Tayan Niwi Ojibwe Bungi, Wa Winumunagug, Miigwech Uendaman and Enimigwan, Bajayan Wagosh, Indigu Minawa Migazi and Do Dame, Namanji Dogish Binisado Tagwan Ojibwe Moyan, Bungi. English too. They asked me to share with you for an evening. They didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. I am really excited to be here tonight. We get to think about something other than the election. And I'm really happy to be in community with you. You know, we're at a time when there are over 10,000 books banned in American schools. It is the highest number of books banned in American history. As if there's ever been a time in the history of humans when the book banners were the good guys. So seeing all of you who believe in books and reading and sharing and learning about and holding one another up, I am honored to be in your company, truly. I gave you a brief shout out in my language, Ojibwe, which is one of the indigenous languages of the Americas. It's a little strange to me that mine is one of the first languages, but mine's the one that sounds weird, foreign, and exotic to so many. Colonization, of course, is about taking one language, culture, and religion and using it to supplant the others. And of course, it's often used violence to do that. Of course, when you try to solve all your problems with violence, it makes a bunch of other problems. Now, why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And of course they can't. I am here. I've actually got a couple of books that have come out recently. I'll talk to you about Where Wolves Don't Die in just a minute. But we also have the Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, But We're Afraid to Ask, which is actually out in a couple of editions. This one first came out maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and then we did a revision and a young reader adaptation of that, and then a new edition of the Made for Everybody version because so many things had happened. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that one too. And then I want to hold some space to field your questions so you can think about what those might be and we can have a conversation. As we get started, in my Ojibwe introduction, I was sharing that my native name is Wagush, that means fox, and I come from the Eagle clan. So in the Ojibwe culture, there's a clan system where there are animals, birds, or fish. They double as a symbol for your family and a spiritual guide of sorts. So I'm from the Eagle clan, come from Leech Lake in northern Minnesota. And the Ojibwe are part of the Algonquian language family, so even the tribes mentioned in the land acknowledgement are cousin tribes to the Ojibwe. Cultural cousins. In our language, Anishinaabe was the original word for like the people. And even in Delaware, where they say Lenni Lenape, they have an L in their language that we don't in Ojibwe. So Lenni Lenape is the word Anishinaabe. It's just the people. So I feel the connection between all of that and all of the things that have been going on. Maybe just a touch more on me to kind of set the stage for our conversation, not because it's the most important thing for you to know, but simply because nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all a little bit different. So, a couple of things that might be useful for you to know. First of all, I get to live in my home community, and I get to wear a whole bunch of different hats. Sometimes it surprises people when you look at me because I'm pretty brown and braids, well, man bun today, and some beads. But my father is not native at all. He's an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He has an amazing story of his own. When we get to questions, feel free to ask more. It's taken me a while in my adult life to just come to terms with and love all the parts about me, and I teach my children to love all the parts about them. None of us are really fractions. I'm a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We're all layers of all the different things about us, from the many different ethnicities, races, cultures, experiences, gender identity, all those things, they all intersect with one another. My father did make it out of there at age 13. It was age 14 by the time he made it to America. At age 17, he lied about his age and signed up for the U.S. Army. I think he wanted to kill Nazis. World War II was still going. And they ended up sending him to the Philippines, so he was stationed in the so-called Pacific Theater. But eventually, and I'm skipping through all kinds of amazing history, he made his way to Minnesota, and eventually he met his mom, and here I am. My mom is Ojibwe. She's actually was enrolled at White Earth, which is in northwestern Minnesota, but lifelong resident on the Leech Lake Reservation. She had a pretty visceral experience with poverty and some amazing efforts to come on out of that. All the kids had to help with food production when she was a little kid. There are 10,000 enrolled tribal members at Leech Lake, and she lived 18 years in a row on the res. And during those 18 years, she met one professional Native person ever. And it wasn't because out of those 10,000 people, nobody wanted to be a police officer or a teacher or a social worker or any of the things. It was because the systems excluded Native people from such positions, even on a reservation. And the one professional person she met, by the way, was the school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. So she ended up going to nursing school. One of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. and she went back to school, and she got a law degree. She was actually the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. When I was a little kid, she'd bring me with her to court, and she'd say, "You just sit there and don't say a word." So I'd sit there, not say a word. And I couldn't remember her court cases very well, but I remember things. I remember that she was the only woman in court. I remember that she and her law partner, another Native person named Paul Day, that they were the only Natives in court. And I just came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. It was the D in the DEI, diversity representation role models, so vitally important. We got so much further to go. But I think it instilled in me, both of my parents in different ways, a sense of my own capability and right to try to do things. Our family motto, by the way, is often wrong, but never in doubt. And so I've tried to think about how can we do more of this, and how can we do it better and differently. And you know what, the stories we hear about the American dream, like work hard, good morals, you too get a piece of sweet American apple pie, I feel like it's half true. And the true part's what I saw my dad do and what I saw my mom do. But I'm kind of with George Carlin, the old comedian, when he said they call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. And I think by that he simply meant that there are barriers out there and they are not equitably distributed. And so I can see on the one hand all the beauty and opportunity and promise of America, and on the other hand I can see all of its oppressions. So in my personal life, we have a large family of 9 kids. If any of you like kids, let me know. We're always hunting for sitters. And I could spend all my time just telling you stories about them and their adventures and me trying to figure out what's going on all along the way. By the way, happy to field questions about the personal as well as the professional. And now I feel very blessed in so many different ways. I get to live in my home community, and it is quite an experience. I sit on a 3-legged stool, and one of the legs is the one that people probably see the least if you're outside of my home community, which is that I am a community servant. I spend about a third of my time officiating at ceremonies, everything from naming ceremonies to funerals in the Ojibwe custom and everything in between. All of that work is uncompensated and in the traditions of our people. That's like one leg of the 3-legged stool. Another one is the obvious part of what I do. I'm a professor of Ojibwe, meaning I teach Ojibwe language, history, culture. I work at a university, publish a bunch of books. And then the third leg is kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's taken me all over the place, all 50 states and much of Canada and even some other countries to boot. To me, those are like 3 strands of a braid. They all reinforce and support one another. And I get to kind of interact with all of them in most everything that I do. I'll talk to you a little bit about where wolves don't die. I've had a love-hate relationship with Native American lit. So, for starters, until about 30 years ago, almost all of the literature about Native people was authored by non-Native people who hadn't even talked to one of us or spent any time in any of our places. Well, that's not Native lit. That's like the white man's Indian. All right? It's an imagining of our experiences rather than a window into our experiences. That's been frustrating. It's starting to change, though. Recently, Louise Erdrich won a Pulitzer Prize. Angeline Bouliz, a New York Times bestselling author. These are Native women authentically grounded in their culture and community, with a wonderful perspective that's showing us something totally different. And there are many others to mention. So the growth has been phenomenal. There's still lots of non-Native people trying to do Native lit, and there are lots of things to be aware of. And I think there's a tension around this stuff. And I'm happy to go there if you want to have more questions about what is appropriate and what's cultural appropriation, and to go deeper into that. And there's more to say. I don't think there's a simple, easy way to define some of those gray area lines, but there are some lines out there. And I do think, as much as possible, we should center and listen to Native voices about Native experiences. Although I have to also say that in recent years, as we've been growing into the space, even a fair amount of the Native authored Native lit are stories of tragedy and trauma. It's stories with characters who lament the culture that they never had because of residential boarding schools and so many other things. And I always found this ironic. Like, I speak Ojibwe. We're doing cultural stuff all the time. There's a drum ceremony every weekend. There are powwows every weekend, all around us. And I spend about 6 weeks every summer officiating at these ceremonies and things like that, in addition to all of the time in between. And so the idea that we lost it all is just bizarre. I think it's really coming out of the way all Americans have been conditioned. The few stories about natives that trickle into the curriculum are stories about sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus and the first Thanksgiving. 87% of educational standards that mention Indigenous anything are stories from before 1900. So there's this assumption that we're something that happened in the past. Last of the blank, and then just fill in the blank with whoever you were talking about. Right? So the story of erasure. So much so that especially when I'm traveling out east or in the American South or a foreign country or something, somebody's saying, it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. I didn't even think about that. So not even in the consciousness. And I wanted to do something different, so I took on, and by the way, most of my work, I have a pretty wide-ranging array of things that I do, right? So I'm trained as a historian. I have written history books, and I've kind of morphed into doing a lot of Ojibwe language works. I have language books, almost all of it nonfiction. This is my first novel. And some people don't make the transition very well, but I think you'll like this one. The story is young adult fiction, as Harry Potter's a young adult fiction, but kind of made for everybody. And there's a 15-year-old kid named Ezra who's looking for clues to a murder, but he's finding himself in the process. So the story is a thriller, but it's also kind of a tender coming-of-age story at the same time. And as we get to questions, I'm happy to talk more about how I go about it and why I've gone about it and things like that. But maybe a couple of things just to help you think about that. For starters, all of us humans, and this is another thing I'd like to say about Native Lit, a lot of times there's this tendency to say, go to a Native author to learn about Natives, go to a Black author to learn about the Black experience, go to a white author to learn about humans, to learn about love, to learn about loss, to learn about all the other things. And of course, that's silly, right? We are all having a human experience. Native Lit is about the human experience, right? And so, for me, I think all of us, for starters, are dealing with this tension about the deep-held desire to love and be loved, to belong, to find connection and meaning in our lives. And, on the other hand, the desire to pull away, to break free, to find freedom and independence. In every friendship, in every marriage, there's often this little tug-of-war. Somebody's pulling this way and someone's chasing them down. Sometimes the roles reverse. It's like that, and this is one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on young adult, a teenager protagonist is that it all comes to a head. It has to. Kids have to break from their parents. They have to do their own thing. If you try to smother that or helicopter that, you end up sapping your kids' independence at their, and belief in themselves and their ability to do adulting. And if you just leave them to it, they'll feel neglected and abandoned and all alone in the world. And so, by the way, nobody's got the perfect answer over how to work that one out. It's called parenting, and you got one shot at it, no do-overs, and the goal is don't mess your kids up and good luck, But that's one of the things that's going on and why it makes such fertile ground for good lit. At the same time, I wanted to show a story that kind of, showed the living, beautiful culture that we have, even though there'd be a story full of tension and things like that. So as Ezra immediately, he's dealing with a loss that had happened prior to the start of the book. He's also immediately embroiled into this murder mystery, whodunit. He's trying to figure it out, but he's implicated, and his family, to protect him from himself and from the city. It starts in northeast Minneapolis. They send him to go run a trap line with his grandfather in the Canadian wilderness. And as this happens, Ezra is trying to find the connection, belonging, and love, and trying to break free, and trying to solve a mystery, and dealing with stuff. So it was a lot of fun working on this. By the way, with my 9 kids, it feels like we're launching one every other year. And so I've been going through this. There have been lots of stuff to think about. And even though it's fiction, it was really personal for me doing this kind of writing. And had me thinking about all kinds of things and feeling all kinds of things. I think, it's doing fiction well, you have to be very attentive to the craft. It is very different than, nonfiction or even some of the history books. Although when I've written history, I've also wanted those books to go somewhere. Fiction still has to have a strong arc, and the characters too, with their evolution and change. If you just have good guy meets problem, solves it, and wins, that's boring. You're not going to keep anybody that way. And how do we speak to these, higher level threads? So I think there's a real art to doing fiction well. By the way, I read about 50 books a year, and every genre you could imagine, from self-help to kids' books to adult fiction to thrillers and all kinds of things. So I don't stay in any one niche, both with my interests and with my work. I think some other things that I'm trying to do in this work, in literature broadly, we've started to do a little better at holding up more work by female authors, and thank God it's about dang time. That's an emerging effort rather than a completed task. We are starting to hold up more work by people from different gender identities, and thank God it's about dang time. That is a very newly emerging effort that is starting to gain traction, but it is not a completed task. We're starting to hold up more work by people of various minoritized identities, and there too, it's all welcome and just beginning. And by the way, most of the 10,000 banned books are by people of color and people with so-called non-conforming gender identities. So it's not always welcome everywhere. I think we've started to have a conversation about what is like toxic masculinity, the unhealthy messages we give to boys about what it means to be a man and things like that. But something we haven't done very much of, that we need a lot more of, is just show people what would healthy masculinity look like. What would it look like for a boy coming of age, going through the things to arrive at something healthier and different? And I do think that this says something about that too. And I certainly think about this with my own kids a lot. We have 5 boys and 4 girls. So yeah, physical and psychological warfare from all of them all along. So, happier to take you deeper into the book as well when we get to some questions. Maybe a couple things that might be helpful. I'd mentioned just in my own introduction how we have a clan system. Ezra's of the Wolf clan. And so that's both like a family membership, but it's also kind of a running metaphor in the book. By the way, what most people have heard about wolves, like the structure of a wolf pack, is, that there's an alpha male that dominates the others and leads, and then a new one can challenge them and take over. And it's all completely false. Yeah, it was based upon one study of wolves in captivity. And wolf packs in the wild are just families. It's just mom, dad, and kids. They hunt cooperatively. They mate for life. They solve problems together. They do not compete over who gets to rule. By the way, if somebody's giving you the message about be the alpha, be the strong one, dominate and lead, their information's all wrong. They're not healthy wolves. They're literally living in a cage, which is where that study came from. And so Ezra's kind of going through things, and, I don't know, I can read a little bit. I won't do too much because, you got the book to read, and there's spoilers in nearly every chapter, so can't give you too many of those. But I'll do a little bit. Do you want tender and touching, or you want some action here? Action. Okay, I'll give you some action. Let me see if I can get this. There it is. I'll give you one action sequence. So other things you might need to know. Do you know what a fisher is? So you know what a weasel is? All right, so weasel is an animal like that long, and they're small, but they're actually a predator. They got sharp little teeth, and they hunt mice, and they'll eat like more than their own body weight in mice. Next up in family is minks, martens, and the biggest one is a fisher. So they're as big as an otter, but they're actually a pretty ferocious predator. All right, so you'll need to know what a fisher is. And, I'll give you a short section of this. At this point in time, Grandpa Liam, who's probably the funnest character to write. By the way, something else that often happens in YA Lit is it's like Mean Girls. You know what I mean? Like all of the characters and all of the dramas, like school lunchroom and bully things. And in our lives, we have people of every age and, all kinds of things. So there are strong, well-developed grandparent characters and parent characters and things like that in this one too. So Liam is the grandpa, and he is a hoot. And so at this point in time, they're a little bit like they've gone from northeast Minneapolis to the res, and they're out in the woods, and they've been running trapline for a while, so they're kind of in a rhythm with it. And this is right before they were going to pull traps. For our last trip to Chief's Ridge, that's kind of where the trap line is, Grandpa Liam and I got to the cabin right at sunset. We planned a couple more weeks trapping before we pulled our sets and closed up for the season. In the fading golden light, we could see footprints all over the yard, in front of the cabin, and up to the shed. They were smaller than a wolf, fox, or coyote, but I couldn't be sure what they were. Grandpa Liam gestured with his mitten. Ezra, they're fisher tracks. All over. They must be scavenging. I bet there's enough residual scent from our previous kills in the shed to keep them poking around. We'll have to be extra careful with our food and hide caching, and we should set a couple sets right on the wall of the shed itself. If they get brave enough to come raiding, we'll be ready. You make the sets. I nodded and brought our supplies in the cabin. Then I spent 30 minutes tacking up fisher sets. I had to finish up with a flashlight in the fading light. I noticed a strong odor coming from the shed, acrid and penetrating. It smelled kind of like skunk, but distinct and oddly stronger. When I came in, Grandpa Liam was working on supper over the drawlet. That's just a stove that is wood-fired and can be used for both cooking and heating. In his suspenders and dickies. What's that weird smell in the shed? Did you notice it? He laughed. Yeah, it's those fishers. They have one of the strongest scent glands in the entire forest. They must have been spraying around in the shed. Once they spray something down, no other predator will touch it. That's how they protect their kills from wolves and bears. Since we were just back from the res, Grandpa Liam had fresh pork chops and potatoes for supper. It was a quick pleasure to finish that off. I read Tracks by Louise Erdrich for a while. The tales of Eli and Nectar somehow reminded me of Grandpa Liam. In the morning, I woke first for a change, eager to check my fisher sets. I stoked the coals in the drawlet, added a couple logs, then slipped on my muck boots and a jacket and went outside. The first hints of dawn were in the sky, but it was still pretty dark, and the overcast sky blunted the first light. But I could see a dark shape where I made the first fisher set on the side of the shed. I strode up quickly, excited at the prospect of a successful kill. Then came a blood-curdling scream from the shed. There is no way to properly describe that sound. It was supernatural, like the worst witch sound in The Conjuring or the Blair Witch Project, only louder. I whipped around faster than a lynx on a snowshoe hare and bolted for the cabin, casting one terrified glance over my shoulder just in time to see a large fisher charging straight at me. An adult fisher can easily weigh 15 pounds, but they grow to 3 feet in length and look much larger in their winter fur, especially when they charge you before you even had a chance to pee first thing in the morning. His first bite caught my jacket from the back before I could get to the cabin door. I could feel him pulling and shaking his head, hissing through clenched teeth. The animal was utterly fearless. The cabin door sprang open, and Grandpa Liam whirled around me in long johns and bare feet with the push broom, Buster close behind, yipping and growling, "Drop the coat, boy!" I unzipped and dropped my coat, turning to face the snarling, furry menace attacking it. Grandpa Liam shouted again, "Grab the axe! Hit him with the blunt end!" "Shouldn't I get the .22? "No! He'll be more likely to shoot one of us or Buster. He's too fast to get a decent shot anyways." The fisher lunged at Grandpa Liam now, snapping the broom handle in his teeth. I had no idea something that size could be so powerful. The axe was next to the cabin door, so I seized it and clenched it in both hands, looking for an opportunity. By the way, the family dog previously described is about 7 pounds. The fisher seemed focused on Grandpa Liam now and Buster by his side. I swung once, furtively, out of fear that I might hit Buster. Then I slowed down and watched the pattern of his attack. Feint, hiss, lunge, retreat, repeat. I hoisted the axe above my head and swung hard on his retreat, catching him right on the back of the head. The fisher dropped in the snow. "Stand on his chest, Ez!" Grandpa Liam was breathing hard now, but smiling wide. "Make sure he's not just stunned. Stand on his chest for 3 whole minutes." I did what I was told. When it was over, Grandpa Liam walked up and gave me a hard clap on the shoulder. "There are easier ways to catch a fisher, but I'm glad you're on my side." I smiled and breathed a sigh of relief. "Why did you tell me to hit him with the blunt end?" "An adult fisher is worth $120. There's no need to ruin the hide." I'm sure the look on my face was completely incredulous. "What? I knew you'd get him." We stood there looking at each other for a moment, Grandpa Liam amused and me still in shock. "Look," Grandpa Liam said, motioning back to the shed. There was another fisher already dead in my trap. He turned and strode through the snow, back into the cabin, still in long johns and bare feet, but hollering over his shoulder, "We're off to a great start today." All right. There's more to read and share about the book. You know, the other one was the everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask, which has kind of been out for a little while and speaking for itself. I'll maybe give you a minute or two just to cue that one up, and then we can start with your questions. So I stumbled into that project very much by accident. I'd finished high school with a plan that a lot of high schoolers have. I'm going to get out of town and never come back. And I got into Princeton University, and I thought, hooray! Everybody who's going to school here is going to be better educated. All the ignorance is behind me. This is going to be awesome. And it was so naive. Like, the first person I met said, "Dude, are you native? Where's your tomahawk?" And I remember thinking, oh no, the brambled racial borderland follows me everywhere I go. Those are the dumbest smart people I ever met, you know. And I ended up having, by the way, a great experience at college. Made wonderful friends. I've hung on to them throughout my life. My freshman year assigned roommate was a Sri Lankan citizen. We stayed roomies for 4 years and best man at each other's weddings and whatnot. And all of that was great and wonderful, but it was also weird. Like, this had happened at times when I was a little kid, going from being a native person to being the native person and developing perspective that way. But I remember at one point I was getting homesick, and I heard that there was this Comanche spiritual leader coming to run sweat lodge ceremonies out in the New Jersey woods. Princeton's down in New Jersey. And I remember thinking, the Comanche are from Texas and Oklahoma, so why is someone out here in New Jersey running ceremonies? And is this like charlatan or a Fruit Loop, like, have pipe well travel, culture for sale kind of thing? But I also thought, if it's anything like home, it'll be all right. I'm going to check it out. So I went out there, and there were a couple surprises waiting for me. It was about 4 p.m, beautiful sunny day. Surprise number 1, there were about 20 people waiting for the ceremony, and they were all white. Surprise number 2, they were all naked. And I had mixed feelings, like, part of me wanted to laugh. Like, it's 20 naked people standing around in the woods, like, hey, how's it going? How's it going? Like, what do you do, right? Part of me wanted to run because, dang, that's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. I'm out. And part of me was getting mad, like, are you serious? Like, get naked, dance around a fire? Is that what you think our culture's all about? Come on. Being naive, though, I shut off the car, got out. And I was immediately folded into a tight embrace by a naked stranger who starts hugging me, saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So now, like, awkward. The desire to laugh, run, get mad, it's just growing. I looked at this woman's face. She was the elder. There were tears welling up in her eyes. It occurred to me that no matter how misguided she was, yes, she was misguided, that her emotional response was sincere. And this thing that happens to people from a minoritized group that doesn't happen to everyone else as much happens, where you have to be like spokesperson for a whole group of people. I remember thinking, like, I got a house full of natives. I have no idea what they're thinking most of the time, much less anyone else. I can only speak for me. But I also realized that if I just walked away, she'd keep thinking whatever she's thinking, and there were some problems with that. And if I just got mad and told her off, the only native she met would be an angry one. So I had to think fast, and I was like, ma'am, could you put some clothes on? Because I would love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we had a good talk. And I think she learned a few things, but in a weird way, I did too. And one of the things that I learned was that it's valuable to try to make safe space, to try to give people a meaningful answer, not just an angry rebuke. To assume everyone's just doing the best that they can until you're truly proven otherwise. And it has enriched my life immeasurably. After that, I started saving the questions. Is it Indian, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? What is tribal sovereignty? How does that work? What's going on with indigenous languages? What do you think about that Dakota Access Pipeline? What do you think about the Redskins being the commanders? Whatever. And so I was saving the questions, and then I realized I know what it's like living in this body, in the place where I grew up. But my mom, who had like a law degree and became a judge, I still would have been hard-pressed to give you a decent explanation of tribal sovereignty by the time I was done with high school. Our educational system has left all of us wanting. And so, as I saved the questions, I had to hunt for answers. And I am still hunting. But as I was saving them up and hunting for answers, I was finding all kinds of them in all kinds of places. Eventually, it turned into talks and turned into a book, and then different iterations of the book as time went on. And so as we open it up for your questions, you can ask anything you want, and I will shoot straight. So if I don't know, I'll be like, I don't know. If it's something that's a subject of debate, some Native people think like this, some think like that, well, I'll share that with you. And just bear in mind, I'm one person. I'm shaped by all the things about me, who I am, where I come from, my age, gender, sexual orientation, all those sorts of things. So you will get a Native perspective, just like I couldn't ask, what do white people think about abortion, good or bad, and get a simple, easy answer? Or what do they think about the election tomorrow, and expect that all white people are going to have the same idea? You know, it's like that for Natives too. How do they vote? Just like white people. You know, like, right? It's complex, it's layered. And so bear that in mind, but you can ask anything you want, whether it's about one of the books, life, or solving the complex and beautiful world that we live in. Who wants to get me started? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everything you said.
Wait, can I interrupt? Because we do have the live stream so people can hear your question. Would you want to speak into the mic?
Oh,
so people
sure. I'm sorry, of course. Thank you very much. It was amazing, and we learned a lot, I think, and so many questions. I'm going to ask you a very simple question, not putting you on the spot to speak for others, but about you. Why did you entitle this Indians, the rest I'm leaving out, rather than natives or indigenous,
Yeah, terminology.
Yeah.
First of all, it fit better and it's funny. But actually, to give you a little context and background, there is a terminology debate for so many different groups, and this one is not yet fully resolved. It's complex, and you probably get some different views from different people. So I do think that it is true, and you might notice in the way that I talk, usually Native American, and Indigenous are all considered politically correct and acceptable and unlikely to have somebody get really offended or upset about. And they are winning out in certain circles. However, I would love for us to do what they did in Canada, where they had a national discussion, representatives from each of the communities, and they agreed that they would use the term First Nation, which speaks to indigeneity, sovereignty, not too many syllables. Everybody knows who you're talking about, and there's agreement behind that. I'd love for us to do something like that, maybe Native nations, just to distinguish us from our Canadian brothers and sisters. That would be perfect. However, as has often happened, with the black community, is it black, is it African American? You cannot use colored people, but maybe people of color as a more inclusive, minoritized racial group label. Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine, we've gone round and round in many different circles, and there are reasons behind all of them. For us too, like some people have said, well, indigenous is pretty broadly configured. So a Maori person indigenous to New Zealand may object to being called white in America, but they're indigenous to New Zealand, not indigenous to North America. So then you have to use a lot of syllables and say North American indigenous, and Indian is shorter, It's one of the arguments that's out there. I'm not saying whether it should be the one that decides things. Also, for Native people in America, there are layers to identity. So one of the things that is distinct from that of many other racial minorities is that there is a political identity to be a citizen of a Native nation, an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe. And so, you know what I mean by that? Yeah, so if you go to Navajo Nation in Arizona, there is a land, and there are borders to this reservation. It's a piece of land. There's a Native nation there. They have their own courts. They have their own police force. If you break the speeding law, you will go to Navajo Nation court. If you don't speak Dene, then you can hire a translator and you go to court in the Dene language. It's its own place. The citizens of the Navajo Nation are citizens of the Navajo Nation and citizens of the United States. So it's like a dual citizenship. So that's another layer to identity. So as a way to differentiate this political identity as separate from having indigenous roots somewhere in the world, some have held on to the term Indian or even American Indian as a label to distinguish the political identity from the social ones or the biological ones. Also, just, there's a lot more to say about who gets to be a citizen of a native nation. Most of the native nations require proving 25% of your blood comes from that particular native nation. Some require 50%. Some have changed it to lineal descent from an original member. But political identities go through a political process. So to be a citizen of the United States, if you are born here right now, that makes you eligible for citizenship in the United States. And there is a process for others to become citizens. Native nations don't usually have a process for others to become citizens if they are residents of a native nation. So there is a biological determination for most. However, there are lots of people who are biologically native but are not eligible for citizenship in a native nation, right? So even Sequoyah, a name that might be well known to Americans, he's Cherokee. He developed the Cherokee syllabary. So they have a tonal language, and they have 87 characters in the Cherokee syllabary. We have 26 in the English language, right? It's a complex thing, and he was literate only in Cherokee. It was a pretty remarkable development. Most indigenous languages developed writing systems based upon European writing systems or things like that. So, but when the Trails of Tears were going on, March the Cherokee, to Oklahoma, he said, screw that. And he walked with a bunch of other people to Mexico to avoid the oppression. So he was not an enrolled member of Cherokee Nation, right? And then there were all kinds of other things that have happened over the years. In Canada, they used to provide citizenship in a First Nation to anybody of any race who had married a citizen of that First Nation. So there are lots of people who are not biologically indigenous who are on the rolls, and there are many people who are biologically indigenous who are not on the rolls. So the political definition of citizenship is complex and sometimes contested. In addition to that, there's a social definition, seeing each other on the street. Usually that is a little bit more loose. I mean, you'll find people who have their own definitions or ideas about what does it mean to be authentically native or something like that. But usually people are more generous in their assumptions. So there, one drop native, you're native. You get to have a native life. You can lean into your ceremonies, culture, and customs if you want. But we have no choice over how we get othered by others. Natives have the highest rate of marriage to people from outside groups of any group in the country, so the native population is especially multiracial. So all of those complexities are there. So there seems to be a use to having something that says politically indigenous and something that says socially indigenous. And indigenous doesn't quite cover either one perfectly. So that's why there's still you'll see many different vocabulary choices. So you'll see organizations like the National Congress of American Indians, the American Indian Movement, and it's not because they're anti-indigenous. They're trying to find a way, and maybe they don't want to change their acronyms, either, but, so there's a hang on to some of that for some people. I think, you'll find you won't find the word Indian in this book. But it's here, and some context provided to help people understand that. But like I said, I would love for us to be able to Native Nation or something to distinguish the political entity as opposed to world indigenous, but resident of. Yeah. Oh, it does, and there are other organizations like the Native American Rights Fund. They're still very effective on sovereignty issues and have tried to use and frame it that way. So it is just an unsettled debate. Yeah, and I probably won't settle it well tonight, but at least you can see some of the arguments around it. For me, for our conversation, I'll use them all somewhat interchangeably, aware of their shortcomings, just to create the safe space. But I do think labels matter, and I usually tell people, if you're on a school board, if you're working for a nonprofit, well, you have a conversation with your indigenous stakeholders. You talk about all these things, you do what they say, and that puts you in touch with your Native stakeholders in empowered positions, and it gets you a get out of getting beat up around the ears card, and we could all use one of those. Yeah.
You're amazing, because one simple question, you answered almost all the questions I was going to ask.
The spirits told me.
I grew up in Western New York in K through 12 integrated school. I think the year before I started kindergarten, the Indian school was in operation. So I think I may have been part of the first group. My question involves the involvement of the states, the United states like New York State or Arizona or whatever, in the Native American. So if like the Navajo, do they issue their own driver's licenses? Do they, voting if you live on the reservation? And most of these questions weren't answered in school because we followed all the standard textbooks, and some of these questions I never asked, and now I'm asking them.
Yeah. Here too,
I know it's complex.
there's a lot of stuff to unpack, but for starters, like on the most basic level, Native nations predated the United States. We were here first, continued to exist through all of America's history, and still exist to this day. If you remember back to like 9th grade civics class for U.S. history, there was this debate with the Federalist Papers and stuff like that. How much power do we put in the federal government and how much to state governments? And the U.S. Constitution is structured, for both better and worse, to say that all power is inherently held by states, except for defined federal powers, like an army for the common defense, system of taxation and laws, so forth. And so dealing with natives is one of those defined federal powers, right? So the Trade and Intercourse Clause says only Congress, meaning only the U.S. Congress, shall regulate trade and manage affairs between the several states and various Indian tribes. Between that and the Treaty Clause, which says treaties are the supreme law of the land, the feds deal with native nations. So now that's what the Constitution says. There's been a lot of court cases to unpack that have shaped and influenced that over time. The Marshall Trilogy would be a famous example of that, in which natives won their court cases, affirming their inherent sovereignty, but Justice Marshall wrote in his ruling that they are native nations, but they are domestic, dependent nations, even using language like little red children to their great white father. And then that word stuck, right? So it set up this ambiguous second-class citizenship, but still the essential tenets of native nationhood predating the United States on a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government persisted. Now, there were other ones too, plenary power doctrine and others, but even with the Crow Dog case, you had a native kill a native in a native space and could not be, justice was handled according to Lakota custom in that case, but the effort to have him tried in a state or territorial court for murder failed because the state had no jurisdiction over him. So then there were efforts to pass federal legislation to intrude on tribal sovereignty, what they called the Major Crimes Act. So cases of murder, rape, and then the rest are all property crimes, arson, larceny, things like that, then the U.S. federal government will assume jurisdiction. So there was this creeping intrusion into native nationhood. So you will notice like tribes don't keep their own armies, for example. There's certain attributes of sovereignty that you might expect from a truly sovereign nation that are blunted in the American experience for native nations. However, most of our lives today are governed by state laws. Marriage, divorce, now abortion, things like that. So those laws do not have the same blanket effect over all native people. And there have been other intrusions into sovereignty, but for the most part, you could think of it like this. If a state has a law that says gaming and gambling is illegal, except for Powerball, pull tab, and church bingo, then those laws will not apply to a native nation, and they can create a casino complex regardless of what state laws say, because they are governed by tribal laws. And so in many states, that is exactly what has happened. And you can almost use your imagination as to the things, like when it comes to business, commerce, pharmaceutical regulation, most of this stuff, like tribes could do all kinds of things. I think the main inhibition is just the imagination for what they could do. That doesn't mean that all efforts are advisable. In some states, tribes were early legalizers of recreational marijuana before the state around them did that. Whether that was politically advisable or not is a separate debate, but it's within their authority to do so. There have been experiments with federal legislation to impose state criminal jurisdiction over tribes, so a handoff from the feds to the state. But that law, Public Law 280, applied in certain states, not everywhere, and did not affect the civil jurisdiction. So you still have a lot of life governed by tribes. And the jurisdictional issues can be complex, where you have checkerboards and native and non-native people living within the same space. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but, the sexual assault rates in America are very high. Depending on which studies you look at, some will say as few as 25% of women in America will be sexually assaulted. The sexual assault rates for native people are twice the national average, 50%. Most crime in America is white on white and black on black and things like that, but crimes of sexual violence directed at native women are predominantly perpetrated by white men. And so, for the most part, the legal apparatus has said tribes have jurisdiction over their own members, but not anybody else. So white men could come onto a reservation and prey with impunity. So the effort to address that has been handled through the Violence Against Women Act, and it's gone through many different iterations, but the problem until very recently was that this was a piece of legislation that would bridge some of these jurisdictional shortcomings, but it would have to be constantly reauthorized by Congress. And it would get held up in the Potomac two-step as people are fighting over things like wanting to get a pipeline pushed through, worried about tribes being an impediment to pushing through the pipeline, and holding up the VAWA legislation just to stick it to the tribes and stuff like that. So more recently, we had a no sunset clause put in on some parts of the VAWA legislation, but that piece of legislation needs to be strengthened and expanded to further cover the issues with missing and murdered Indigenous women and so forth. So again, layers, but like I live in Minnesota, all of the tribes, like we understand the inherent nature of sovereignty. We have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, but we still talk to the states because we got to get along and got to get stuff done. Yeah, and depending on what happens tomorrow, if Harris Waltz get elected, we will have the first female and the first native governor in the U.S. Peggy Flanagan should be pretty dang awesome. So.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Time for one more. I was giving too long answers. Okay.
But we will do book signing after this, so I saw
All right.
her hand go up first.
That's actually what I was going to ask you about. How exciting is that? Like, I'm sure.
I'm pumped. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I think Harris has a slight edge, but I've been surprised to the negative before. But I've known Peggy Flanagan since before she was in politics, and her dad, you know, who they're a pretty awesome family. She is authentic and real and grounded and from her community, not a Johnny-come-lately. She's smart, she's thoughtful, she is progressive. Yeah, I believe in her. And, you know, I think, you know, the breaking of the barriers is significant and notable, as was Deb Holland's appointment and things like that. But she's a decent human being who is an effective politician. And we're in a state, you know, that actually enshrined protections, you know, for abortion, trans rights, and a prohibition against book banning. So, you know, we made it that far in the past 2 years, and she was leading a lot of those efforts. So it also depends. We're in a very purple state, and not just because of Vikings and Prince. I mean, politically a purple state. So it depends, too, not just on what happens with, you know, who the governor is, but what happens with the state legislature in Minnesota for her ability to push through, you know, the agenda, if we have that happen. So fingers crossed. Yeah. You have been awesome. So many questions. We could go for hours more. I encourage you to get the books. They're selling outside. I'll come outside. I'll take more questions and sign books. And I've got cards on the table, so you can grab one if you want to keep in touch. Thank you so much. Free educator guides. Yep.
Yeah, yep, get this one. Another round of applause for Dr. Anton Treuer. It was great conversation, and thank you for coming again. One more page is selling the books, but we will start the line here with Brittany if you want to raise her hand to sign books. Thank you guys again, and we hope to see you again